Welcome to Poker Hands Dissected number 3. Pretty simple here. We break down the thought process of a player who submits a hand and kind of provide commentary on what they should have done, what they shouldn't have done, so on and so forth. So let's just jump right into this hand. So we have Queen 9 in the big blind. Get one limper. Raise. And our player decides to call. Let's take a look at the logic here. And he says, I call because we are very deep and I feel I'm getting a good price. You, in fact, are getting a good price. The only problem with this getting a good price logic is for a lot of players, they'll call with their spec type hands. They will be getting a good price, but based on their skill and understanding of the game, they don't really account for two things. One, their ability to actually extract max value when they actually do flop their best hand. And number two, their ability to make mistakes. I call them slippery slope mistakes. So a lot of players will just, all right, let me call, let me see a flop. And you get a hand like Queen 9 that's got a lot of value based on like what this guy said, but the flop comes like 9, Jack 2. And then all of a sudden, you lead out and the player calls you and just can't get away from the hand. And I see a lot of amateur beginner players or even pretty decent players, they didn't have to put themselves in the spot in the first place. So yeah, you want to recognize the value of these hands, but at the same time, you also want to be able to make sure that you don't fall victim of those slippery slopes, and you also are able to extract the value. Now, he says the main villain in this hand is a player who I have played with many times. He is a competent player and decent winner at this level. I don't not necessarily how he knows that, but due to our history, there sometimes develops a leveling dynamic between us during hands and sessions. Okay, so history and leveling dynamics and all that stuff, it gets tricky because I don't really understand what this player's history is. And I'll see a lot of players use that and excuses when they submit hands to me. Like, no, you don't understand. We had history. That's why I did that. And I was like, all right, well, why'd you do that? Well, you don't understand, Blake. This player knows me really well and knows I would never raise with this subset of hand, or they come up with some sort of excuse. You really need to understand that if you do have history with the player, if there is some sort of leveling going on, or there is some sort of understanding of each other's games, you have to incorporate that actually into your thought process. And that's kind of what I want to see. So, if there is leveling, we want to take into consideration the fact, does our opponent know that we only call with hands that are spec, or we don't really understand the dynamic here, and I would kind of like to see that. Also, another thing, like a lot of players, you can't just simply call out of position with spec type hands. You got to mix it up at times. You got to raise with them sometimes. You can't be one of those really transparent players, which exist a lot at 1-2 and 2-5 live, where they raise with the top of their range and they'll just basically flat or call in position or out of position with a lot of spec type hands. It's kind of very easy to play against. When they hit a flop and they just don't go away, they're likely to have connected. So it's something that I want to call out here, because this dynamic should be repeated throughout the course of this hand. It's not just like, oh, we have history together, done. I want to see that history interjected into the thought process of a hand. And listen, I play a lot of live poker. I have some players that think I'm an absolute nut. I have other players that think I don't know what I'm doing in some of the games that I play with. Like, you want to use that to your advantage, and you should see that in the thought process. So let's see what else he says. We call limp, so it sucks for him. The other player folds, and now he's heads up with this player he has history with. 8-8-10. Okay, so the student's why is I check call because I have a gutter and a backdoor flush draw. I don't think you understand, how useful this is. I check call because I have a gutter and a backdoor flush draw. And the reason why I'm saying that is, whatever people's split instinct is in a specific hand, sometimes you see really how they think about the game. And this might be the kind of player that may talk about leveling or talking about exploitation, but they still only have a value-based approach to the game, meaning do my cards have value in this spot or not? Not let me try to extract value in a different way, or let me try to get creative, or let me try to do things differently. Just a very linear approach to the game of these are my cards, these are the flop, do I like this or do I not like this? And the first thing he says is I check call because I have a gutter and a backdoor flush draw. I also think this flop does not connect with villain's cutoff raising range very well. I would like to see some sort of thought process of not really, does it connect or not? Sometimes it doesn't matter if a player connects or not. What matters is what they're likely to do on later streets. And I don't know, maybe we'd like to see some of that here. All right, for example, this flop does not connect with a villain's cutoff raising range very well. However, this player is likely to bet on a lot of cards on the turn, or I expect him to barrel with me, especially if I called him out of position, or something that gives us a little bit more insight into understanding this leveling dynamic. I don't think a check call is horrible here. I just want to see that. I want to see the dynamic. That's what I'm obsessed with. Like, I really believe that I subscribe to a way more exploitive, a way more you're playing with the person that's sitting in front of you style of game, instead of I'll do this 30% of the time and do this 40% of the time. I mean, like, you're going to want to have that balanced approach when you start off in a game. But the reality is, if you actually have information about a player, you want to use that information to take the best line or to take an action that's going to make you the most amount of money. And I just don't think this player is doing that. Maybe he's playing standard even though he has information. I don't know. Let's look at the rest of this hand. So, King of Diamonds checks back. All right, so it's planning on check raising here, but the villain did not bet. All right, so, you know, if you're going to do something like check raise, again, I don't know the history between this player or what's going on, but you want to say, like, I was planning on check raising here because of X, Y, and Z, and ABC, right? I was planning on check raising because we have a lot of history together, and check raises usually mean that I have a lot of bluffs. But in this specific, you know, situation, I have a lot of cards that will improve my hand on the river, and I believe I can get more value over time if I check raise this player because me and him have that kind of history. And I'm like, all right, well, you know, okay. Like, the reality is that, like, the way live hands are discussed is sometimes, you know, you have so much more information than somebody just that me looking at it. I don't know the history. I don't know what's going on. So the fact that he doesn't have this inside his actual, and this is, I call this the drop off. The drop off is when in earlier stages of the hand, so pre-flop, you're thinking, you're active, you're like, all right, this is what this player's range is. I know he's opening, why, blah, 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 blah. Then the flop, you're like, all right, it doesn't connect with the board, blah, 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 blah. And then all of a sudden there's just like drop off in thought in the turn of river. And it's mainly because a lot of live players just don't have that much experience with thinking along the turn of river. So, and the decision trees and the thinking becomes a little bit more dynamic or a little bit more wide. So they kind of get lost. I kind of feel like that's what's happening here. You know, a little heavy thought process, and then it gets reduced, but we don't know. But planning on check raising here, it didn't work. So let's see what happens. Okay, so he decided to bet 125 into a pot of 150, repping the full house. Villain raised to 300, and I was forced to fold. I mean, this is the kind of like bluffs that don't work. It was one of these things where, like, first, why do you think? What makes you think that you played this hand in a way that is telling the story of a full house? Like, you know, did you actually, you know, check back on the, it just doesn't make any sense. Why would this player ever believe that you actually have a full house? I don't really understand. And it just opens up the floodgate and makes it so easy for you to get re-raised in the spot. And he knows that you're folding so many other hands, except he knows that you don't have hopefully this guy knows that you don't have a full house when you bet out there. And when he bets the 300, he gets pretty much every single other hand to fold. I don't think this is a smart thing to do. It's also one of those things where, like, check raise didn't work on the turn. You're just done with the hand, probably. You kind of ruined your shot to tell a convincing story to this player. However, I have no idea what story you're trying to communicate or what the backstory is here, because you don't tell me. and that's like the poker player's excuse, is like, you don't know. We had history. So I played this hand horribly, because I thought this horrible way of playing the hand will get more value over time. Like, if you really want to factor that information in, you gotta, you know, when you submit a hand, you gotta do it. And listen, I'm discussing this now, not because this is like I'm not picking on this person or whatever. I'm just saying that, like, creative play in poker is an amazing thing and a great thing and something that you should all strive to do. But you want to have some sort of solid reasons behind your creative play, or it's just usually just not creative, it's ridiculous. And I kind of feel like that's what this player is doing here, right? So it's like, oh, let me call out a position as a justification because me and this player have history together, and then not using any of that history to actually form or drive his decision-making process. And also, you know, some of you, and as you sit here, if you want to do a really useful exercise right now. Instead of like posting below and criticizing this player of like, oh, you should have never have checked this or should have never done that. Like that's a waste of time, to be honest. What you should do is you should create a history for the for his opponent. So say like, all right, me and this guy have a lot of history. He knows that I'm a really tricky player and I'm likely to put players in I'm likely to attack a lot of players and I'm really obsessed with attacking weakness. But whatever you decide to come up with is like your archetype of what this player perceives you. And then what you want to do is discuss how you personally would play Queen 9 given these dynamics against that player. So not criticizing this player's play, but putting yourself in those shoes and really creating a story for the cutoff and then really coming up with, some sort of rational reason. I think that's a really great way of improving your thought process and a really great way of seeing how those background or history dynamics lend themselves into an actual hand. So in summary, I don't think this hand was played that well, obviously, but I also don't think that I think the thought process behind this player is flawed, and that's why we saw them play the hand the way that they did. We could look at interesting things and try to figure out like how much exact equity we had against his opponent's range, but I don't have enough information to assume that. So I don't want to go down that route. But post below, let me know if you have any questions or comments. Also, there should be a link below called How to Dissect a Poker Hand. I put together this 2-part free video series that just discusses exactly a systematic way for approaching hand dissection, which is a little bit different than what I'm doing here. But basically, once you go through that process, we've created a private Facebook group so that we can have intelligent conversations about hands. But I want everybody to go through it so we all have a standard and then we can talk about it. Not like, hey, Blake, I was a hijack, I raised this, he called me, flop king, Blake, what do I do? Question mark. Like we want context and we want as much information as possible so we actually give people good advice about what's going on. So thanks again. Let me know if you have any questions. Post below. That's about it. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you subscribe. We are releasing between 2 to 3 videos every single week. Also, make sure you head over to schoolofcards.com/value. The link's below in the description. It's basically our value email list where I do random webinars for free once or twice a month. I also answer questions, submit hands. We release videos that we don't always release on YouTube. So make sure you check out schoolofcards.com/value, enter your name and email, and I'll keep you up to date.